Assalamu alaikum rahmatullah. If you guys can hear me, could you please type yes in the chat box? All right, excellent. Okay, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wassalatu wassalam ala Rasulihi al-Kareem. Amma ba'd. So welcome to this first session of Quranic Salvation, How to Attain Spiritual Triumph. Now, some of you might have registered for this based on the idea that it is a preparation for Ramadan, which inshallah it will be. Um, Others amongst you might have registered based on the fact that it is looking at the curriculum itself. But I wanted to start off with kind of why exactly did I choose the specific ayat and surahs and things like that if you were to look at the curriculum. And the reason simply goes back to when I was, you can say, kind of struggling with reviving myself, whether it was inside of Ramadan or outside of Ramadan. I always wanted some sort of a curriculum or some sort of path to follow through the Quran. And one option would be to just start from the beginning and start studying the Quran, which seems very overwhelming. And of course, with that, you're not, because there's so much to cover and because, just how the ayat are arranged and so on and so forth, it can get very overwhelming. But nevertheless, I was able to do it a few years ago. In fact, I did it and I recorded kind of the entire summarized tafsir juz by juz. Okay. But at the same time, I was still looking for a solid program of study. In other words, something that would bring me closer to Allah and have a connection with the Quran. And what I found was a curriculum by Dr. Asar Ahmad, rahimahullah. And for those of you who may or may not know, Dr. Asar Ahmad was a thinker, a kind of a scholar, you can say, who came out of South Asia, the Indo-Pak area, and he has a curriculum that he set up, or a series that he set up called Muntakhab Nisab. Now, what I've done is with this particular series, I've based it on that particular series that he had set up. And the reason is because I was able to benefit from it tremendously. Now, of course, that series is in Urdu. I don't know if it's in English or not. But if you're looking for a better version, and if you understand Urdu, then definitely get a hold of that one. But nevertheless, with this series, what we're going to be doing is I'm going to be following the same curriculum, but obviously because of he recorded those his lectures in a certain time, in a certain space, in a certain area that he was in, and I'm going to be updating some of that related to our context in the West in the time period that we're living in. So where there will be some differences, but the general overall structure is going to look like that. Now, that particular series actually spans 6 levels. And so what we're going to be doing in the next 4 weeks is going through level 1, which is going to be, bi'idhnillah, very intense. And hence you'll notice the subtitle, a 4-week intense Quran transformation series. So the thing you want to be aware of is that this is not going to be something that's going to be very easy, in the sense that if you're thinking it's going to be a quick, 30-minute lecture and just something to kind of get your iman up and ready to go, and that's it, you will be disappointed, because the expectation here from your end is that you will put in the effort, inshallah, listen to the webinars if you can live, and apply what you've learned. Right now, that application means both in terms of yourself, your soul, your spirit, your interaction with other people, and at the same time also memorizing the ayat and the surahs, right? So that it's not just something that you walk in with, like, okay, I know the general idea of the surah, but you're also spending some time with the Quran itself. Now, the structure, just to kind of go ahead and get started in earnest, because I wanted to kind of jump right into the material, and then any sort of issues related to the logistics or anything like that, we can take up in the Q&A. So where exactly does this curriculum start? It starts with Surah Al-Asr. And the way to think about this curriculum is that Surah Al-Asr, as we'll get into in a few minutes here, is your basis. Basically, it's where you're going to start in terms of how to get success or how to get salvation. And if you think about it, every single human has some idea of success or some idea of accomplishing something, right? In fact, it's what distinguishes us, or one of the things that distinguishes us from the animal kingdom. When animals have an idea of success, let's say, it's very instinctive. And so they have certain, you can say, base desires, which they need to fulfill immediately. But in terms of some sort of long-term plan, the animal kingdom, it's not there. So one of the things that distinguishes us from the animal kingdom is this idea of having some sort of a plan, some sort of idea of success. Now, that idea could be correct, it could be incorrect, but the point is that there is something that we say is related to success. Now, in our day and age, that success can be defined by money sometimes, but I don't want to take that as an example because that's kind of the quintessential example. Everyone takes, well, success is the example of, money is the example of success. Some people have other things related to success, and it may be very altruistic. So some people have the idea, okay, well, success is to basically help certain poor and impoverished people, and that is their idea of success. And whereas there may be an element of truth to that, that might not be the entire gamut of what we mean by success or what we're going for in terms of salvation and triumph, spiritual triumph. Other people may have other ideas, but the point is that every single human is heading towards something. If you're in college, you're heading towards a degree because that, in your mind, that degree will get you to the next stage of what you've either explicitly or implicitly defined as success for you. So if what you've defined as success for you is, okay, well, getting that degree and then moving on from there to get the job, which will then move up the next level and then climb up the corporate ladder or whatever it might be until you reach wherever it is that you're going. Okay. As I mentioned, other people may have other elements of success. If you're in the workforce, there may be certain elements where you say, okay, well, when I make a certain amount of money, right, then that'll be successful. For entrepreneurs, it may be, well, when I reach a certain level of, transactions, whatever it is, every single human being has some idea of success. So the question we want to start off with is that our own idea of success, our own idea when it comes to achieving something, is that in line with what we were made for, what we were created for? Okay, and we'll talk more about this shortly, bi'idhnillah. So one of the things to understand about Surah Al-Asr is that in terms of defining success, it is one of the shortest surahs and one of the most comprehensive surahs that is related to this idea of success. Okay? Surah Al-Asr, a couple of introductory points related to that. Number one, understand that Surah Al-Asr is basically, in terms of its size, it's 3 ayat. Okay? So as we know, Surah Al-Asr starts off بعد أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم والعصر إن الإنسان لفي خسر إلا الذين آمنوا وعملوا الصالحات وتواصوا بالحق وتواصوا بالصبر. Right? So by time, indeed mankind is in loss except for those who have believed and done righteous deeds and advise each other to truth and advise each other to patience. Okay, so it is composed of 3 ayat. Now let's stop here for a second. When we think about the ayat and surahs in the Quran, sometimes they'll translate surahs as chapters. And ayat is maybe, I don't know what they translate, signs, right? Or sentences, whatever it might be. But the first thing we want to understand is that when it comes to the arrangement of the Quran, what is considered a surah and what is considered an ayah has nothing to do with logic. It has nothing to do with grammatical principles. it is purely what they call tawqifi, meaning it is mawquf upon the Prophet ﷺ, meaning that wherever the Prophet ﷺ said that an ayah starts and ends, then that is considered an ayah. And whatever the Prophet ﷺ said that a surah starts with this many ayat, it started there and it ended there, that was what a surah is. So as you know, in the Quran, the largest surah is Surah Al-Baqarah, which surpasses 2 juz. I mean, it's massive. And a short surah is like this one, Surah Al-Asr, which is composed of 3 ayat. And those ayat in and of themselves are short. Some ayat are very large. Ayat al-Kursi is one of the large ayahs. And some of the ayat in Surah Al-Baqarah, which were revealed at the tail end of the Prophet ﷺ, they're very large. So there is no sort of principle or some sort of intellectual endeavor that you have where you say, okay, this is now considered an ayah. Basically, what was defined as an ayah is from the Prophet ﷺ. And what is defined as surah or a surah is also from the Prophet ﷺ. Okay. Now, why am I bringing that up? Well, one of the things that we have to understand, when you look at the Quran and you look at, from beginning to end, you notice that in the beginning, like if you opened it from page 1, after Surah Al-Fatiha, right, after Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen, you have the largest surah in the Quran, which is Surah Al-Baqarah. Then you have other large surahs, Surah Al-Imran, you have Surah Nisa, and so on and so forth, large surahs. And then as you get closer and closer to the end, you have shorter, succinct surahs. Now, this ordering of the Quran also comes from the Prophet ﷺ, meaning it's not in the order of revelation. As you know, that the Quran, when it started to be revealed, it started with Iqra, Bismi Rabbika alladhi khalaq, which is not the first chapter. But the question that some of the scholars asked was, look, if it's the case that the Quran was ordered in this way, that the larger surahs in the beginning and the shorter surahs at the end, why is that the case? Why did the Prophet ﷺ make it such that the larger surahs in the beginning and the shorter surahs are at the end? Okay. Now, if we think about the shorter surahs, generally they are considered Makki surahs, meaning that they were revealed or they were sent down in the Meccan phase, meaning before the hijrah, before the migration of the Prophet ﷺ. So coming back to the Sirah, the Prophet ﷺ spent some time in Mecca, then migrated to Medina. So those ayat and those surahs that came down before that migration are considered Makki ayat. Those that came after are considered Madani ayat. Now, some of the qualities of the Makki ayat. The qualities of Makki ayat is that a lot of them are focused on Tawheed, or the oneness of Allah. A lot of them are focused on Allah Himself, His names, His attributes, focused on paradise and hellfire, of resurrection, what happens after death, and so on and so forth. So these are the general topics of the shorter Makki surahs, which are found at the end of the Quran. And a lot of those surahs are giving us sometimes rational arguments about doubts that are cast from the viewpoint of, let's say, the mushrikeen, or in some cases, the viewpoint of like the atheist, and we'll talk more about that a little later, or from the viewpoint of other sort of religious factions and so on and so forth. Now, compare that to the larger surahs that are found in the beginning. Those surahs, while they do touch upon Tawheed, they do touch upon, the idea of what happens after death and so on and so forth, what you find in the larger surahs is that you start to find ahkam, rulings. If you look at the shorter surahs, you will not find, or you'll be hard-pressed to find a ruling. Now, what we mean by ruling is something is haram, something is halal. And of course, Aisha radiallahu anha, she mentioned that this was in the wisdom of Allah. Meaning, and she says that if Allah had revealed right at the onset, right at the beginning, that this is halal and this is haram, meaning, let's say fornication. Fornication is haram. And Allah had revealed that drinking is haram. She said that the Arabs would say that we will always fornicate and we will always drink. But it was in the wisdom of Allah that the first surahs, the first ayat to be revealed, were based upon His names and His attributes. Who Allah is. Why is He worthy of worship? The paradise, hellfire, and so on and so forth. It was in the wisdom of Allah, because by that, the person will now, their iman would be fortified, And then, once their iman was fortified, then the ayat related to what is halal and what is haram were revealed, right? And the quintessential example of that is the progression when it comes to outlawing alcohol. It wasn't done in one shot. So first it was, there were ayat that were revealed to say that alcohol, there's some good in it and some bad in it, right? But it's generally bad. Then other ayat which were a little more harsh. Then finally in Medina, at the end, after the hijrah, once the iman had been fortified, then the ayat come down prohibiting it. And now the soul is ready. Now the heart, because it's full of iman, they can get rid of the alcohol in a heartbeat. Okay. Now all of this entire discussion that I start off with, it still doesn't give us an answer as to why the Quran is arranged as it is. In other words, why is it that the Quran is arranged such that the larger surahs, with all the qualities that we mentioned, are in the beginning, and the shorter surahs are at the end? And some of the scholars have mentioned that the main benefit is because, and this applies directly to us, by the way, is because initially, when Islam had just started, the number of Muslims were very few. And then Islam grew. And then Islam, by the end of the mission of the Prophet ﷺ, it became dominant. Not only dominant in the Arabian Peninsula, but after a very short period of time, within a few years, it started to become dominant across North Africa, in Spain, in Asia, Asia Minor, and so on and so forth. All these places, it spread. But what happens when it spread was that now, instead of people becoming Muslim, or let's say converting to Islam, there were more people that were being born into Islam, which means that as a child, the first thing that you teach children, and this may be even in your own experience, is not necessarily, well, look, this is Tawheed, this is the argument for Tawheed, this is the reason why. I mean, you may teach them a little bit about that, right? That, God created everything and he created the sun and the moon, but it's very basic. But one of the things when a child is growing up that you're trying to teach them and trying to inculcate within them is the acts of worship. So if you think about it, when you were being brought up, if you were brought up in a Muslim household and you come from a practicing family, some of the initial things that you're taught are things like wudu, things like the salah, right? Fasting Ramadan, and so on and so forth. But think of it this way, is what you're being taught as a child and as you're growing up are the ahkam in general. Why? Because that's something that you want to teach your children so they get used to it, right? So they get used to praying, they get used to making wudu, they get used to, giving sadaqah and so on and so forth. But those are all related to ahkam. Those are acts of worship. And when you look at the order of the Quran, it's as if in the wisdom of Allah, he understood that when the Islamic state or the Islamic religion spread, you would have more and more children that would be brought up as Muslims. And so when they come to the Quran, it starts off with more ahkam, and then as they grow up, and when they start to face various doubts and things like that, they're now going into the section related to Iman, which is at the end, the shorter surahs, right? And in our context, Muslims living in the West, what you'll find is that if you've been brought up in a Muslim household, many of us, you were kind of taught those things initially, but then you go off to college, or even, let's say, even starts in high school, and people start to then ask you about your religion. Like, why do you even believe in God? And why is it that he does such and such? And why do you believe such and such? And so the focus for yourself, as if you've been brought up in a Muslim household, it shifts from, okay, well, I pray 5 times a day, but now you want to ask, well, why do I pray 5 times a day? Why do I even believe in God? And so on and so forth. So coming to the Quran, it gives you kind of that progression. In other words, as you're growing up, you'll kind of go to the first section of the Quran, and as you continue to grow, the ayat in the latter section will be more and more applicable to you. Okay. Now, one of the tragedies of our day and age is that the Quran in general has been kind of cut off. Now, there's a number of reasons for that. First and foremost being the Arabic language. But second, even for the people that speak Arabic or were brought up in Arabic households, what we have to understand is that the Arabic that was spoken at the time of the Prophet ﷺ is not the Arabic that's spoken today. It's not the Arabic that people converse with. So if you were to speak the Arabic that was spoken at the time of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, people would look at you strangely. They'd say like, okay, well, what's wrong with this guy, right? You wouldn't walk into a store and start off and saying, qad, and so on and so forth. It would just look at you very strange. And so even people whose native language is Arabic, because over time there's been a degradation of the language, and this is true with any language. So if you think about English, the English that was spoken, the Old English is, if someone were to speak in that form today, it would seem very odd. In fact, if someone were to speak the way they spoke 50 years ago, it would seem odd, right? So if someone traveled through time from 50 years ago, came and was alive today, and they started to hear some of the nomenclature that's used in English, they might be very confused. So the point is, if within English, within 50 years, there was a degradation, it was even more so with the Arabic language. And so as time moves on, people start to get further and further away from the Arabic, which in a sense drove them further and further away from the Quran as well, until we come to our point where there's almost this complete detachment from the Quran. So some of the things that we read about the Quran, or about the effects of the Quran, for us, some of that is just missing. Like, how is it that people would listen to the Quran or they would read the Quran and tears would well up in their eyes? Well, you might be thinking, well, that's never happened to me. I mean, I've never been where, the Quran has been recited and tears welled up in my eyes. Maybe it has, but for many people, that never happened. So when it comes to the Quran, and when it comes to this course and where we're starting from and so on and so forth, understand that one of the goals by starting with Surah Al-Asr, besides the others that I'm going to mention in a second, is that because we're starting with a shorter Makki surah, we're starting with this idea of fortifying the Iman. And we're doing that by breaking down one of the easiest surahs in the Quran, if not the easiest surah in the Quran. Right? Now, there's some difference of opinion about that. Some people say it's very easy. Some people say it's one of the easiest. But the point is, as we break it down, first and foremost linguistically, and then we get into kind of some of the philosophical implications, some of the spiritual implications, some of the implications related to character within ourselves and how that's applicable to the people around us. As we deconstruct all that, the idea is that there will be an attachment to the Book of Allah. So we start off with Surah Al-Asr with this kind of view. Now, with that said, the other reason we're starting off with Surah Al-Asr is because of its importance. Now, what do I mean by importance? This surah, Surah Al-Asr, it is the most important surah in the Quran related to success, as I mentioned. And when it comes to success, this is something that everyone is striving for, as I mentioned earlier as well. And so, therefore, while it's not the most important surah in the Quran, because someone may say, what about Surah Al-Fatiha? Right? That is the summary of the Quran. And someone may say, what about Surah Al-Ikhlas, which is 1/3 of the Quran? And it is basically the key to Tawheed, and so on and so forth. So I'm not saying it's the most important, but from the angle of success, from the angle of salvation, it is the most important. And so if the person with the viewpoint of how do I succeed in this life and the afterlife, it therefore then becomes the most important surah in the Quran. Now, a couple of other things to note, that this surah has 3 ayat. And there are only 3 surahs in the Quran that have 3 ayat. Okay? And there's no surah in the Quran that has less than 3. Okay, there's no surah that has 1 or 2 ayat. The shortest you'll find in the Quran is 3 ayat in a surah. Okay? Now, just for your information, so one surah is Surah Al-Asr. The second surah is Surah Al-Kawthar, which has 3 ayat, and Surah Al-Nasr. These are the 3. Okay? So 3 surahs that have 3 ayat. And that's why some of the schools of Islamic law gave the opinion that in the salah, the minimum that you would need to recite after Surah Al-Fatiha, right? So in the salah, we recite Surah Al-Fatiha and then we recite some Quran. The minimum you need to recite is 3 ayat. But of course, there's a severe difference of opinion in this as well, because what happens when you come to a surah like Ayatul Kursi, which is much longer than Surah Al-Asr. Now, does that count as 1 or 3 or 5 or how? So, point being is that where they got this idea of minimum of 3 is because there are 3 surahs in the Quran which have 3, and the shortest surah in the Quran is 3 ayat. Okay, now, the other thing to understand about Surah Al-Asr and kind of why we're using it, what I'd like you to picture is that Surah Al-Asr is like the seed, okay? Like if you imagine planting a seed in the ground, that seed will eventually germinate. It will then, it will grow. It will have a root, trunk. It will have branches, and those branches will then sprout leaves, and so on and so forth. So what Surah Al-Asr is, it's basically, if we wanted to give an analogy, it's like the seed. And we start off by the kind of the bare minimum when it comes to elements of success. And that bare minimum as we go forth, so we're starting off with Surah Al-Asr, then we're going to go up to what's known as Ayatul Bir, then we'll move on to ayat from Surah Al-Luqman, and so on and so forth. And as we go through this entire journey, you could say, we're going to be seeing more and more elements of Surah Al-Asr bloom. And so that's why we start with Surah Al-Asr and we look at it as an analogy of a seed, and then we'll move on from there. Okay. And this isn't something that's kind of against the Quranic methodology. In fact, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions in Surah Hud, is Alif Lam Ra, Kitabun Uhkimat Ayatuhu, Thumma Fussilat Min Ladun Hakim Khabir, and it is a book which is ayat. They're found ayat which are then founded upon. Meaning you've got short and profound and deep ayat, right? Like Surah Al-Asr. And then later on, they're then expounded upon. So certain ayat, as you've ever studied what's known as the Quran or the methodology of tafsir of the Quran, you know that the elements of the Quran explain other elements. In fact, the shorter surahs or shorter ayat are later then expounded upon. You get to see kind of that germination, that growth. And Surah Al-Asr is no different. Okay. Now, another quality of the surahs that come at the end is that because the surahs were being revealed to, or being sent down to initially the mushrikeen, those people that committed that type of shirk, because it was initially being sent down to them, it has the quality of trying to basically shake the person, or basically wake up the person as if they were in a state of slumber. And so when you see some of the ayat, they're very, I don't want to say harsh, but they're very poignant in the sense that when they come like very quick, almost like lightning, right? So al-qariya, mal-qariya, wa ma adraka mal-qariya, right? And so this, so it's related to this idea of the shaking and Surah Al-Zilzal, for instance, right? إِذَا زُلْزِلَتِ الْأَرْضُ زِلْزَالَهَا, right? When the earth then shakes. And this type of shaking is to basically wake up the person, right? And so it's giving the person a worldview. In other words, the Arabs at that time were in a certain paradigm, a certain worldview. Their ideas of success had to do with certain things, right? So their ideas of success had to do with, let's say, certain financial transactions, believe it or not, okay? Certain ideas of the idols that they would be worshiping, and so on and so forth. So they had, just like any other human being, had this idea of success. And that determined their worldview. Now, the way these ayat, the Makki ayat, especially the ones at the end, come, is as if they're shattering that worldview. And for us, it's the exact same thing. Because for us, we live in a certain worldview. We have a certain paradigm that we're in. Success for us has been, by the society around us, by social pressures and so on and so forth, has been defined in a certain way. And when Surah Al-Asr comes, for example, it completely demolishes that and says, no, actually what success is such and such. So these ayat in the end, when they come like lightning. And they're supposed to have this type of effect where they just kind of wake the person up. And as if they were in a state of slumber, meaning they have a certain worldview. These ayat that come down, they shatter that worldview and they say basically this is the correct worldview and here is why this is the correct worldview. Now, remember I had said that Surah Al-Asr is easy. Now, it's both easy and it's deep. Now, don't get that mixed up with being easy and difficult. That's not what I mean here. And it's easy in the sense that it's short and it has a limited number of words. And many of these words, once you understand them, it's easy to understand the whole surah when it's put together. Okay. In fact, some would argue that the entire Quran is like that because Allah says, وَلَقَدْ يَسَّرْنَا الْقُرْآنَ لِذِكْرِ. Indeed, we have made the Quran easy for remembrance. But keep in mind that the approach to the Quran is not only just for tadhkir or dhikr, right? It's not just for remembrance. It's not just to recite it as much as you can and get the reward for reciting it. But there's an element of thinking deeply about it. What's known as tadabbur. It's the tadabbur of the Quran. It's to think deeply about the Quran. And the way this works, and Ibn al-Qayyim al-Jawzi, rahimahullah, he mentions that, this term dhikr, it refers to this idea of something that is in the back of the head or the back of the mind, and it's brought forward. And so therefore, that's why it's not called like remembrance, right? That's why they call dhikr is remembrance, to remember, to remind. But the point is that if a person hasn't done tadabbur, hasn't dived into the ocean of the Quran and tried to understand the depth of the meaning of the Quran, then there's really nothing there to actually bring to the front of the mind, right? You have to actually understand the depth and swim through that depth to actually acquire it such that you're able to hold it within your mental repertoire for you to actually bring it forward. So it's easy for remembrance, but it's still deep and it still takes effort to understand the Quran. But once you do understand it, and then you do bring it to the surface, that's when you start to truly feel the effects of what's known as dhikr. Okay, now let's go ahead and kind of look at the surah, kind of starting from the words of the surah. So it starts off, wal asr. Now, the first thing you'll notice in the translation, it says by time. And it's an oath. And we'll talk a little bit more about oaths and their importance and how is it that Allah would make an oath, right? Because typically when you make an oath, you make it to something that is greater than yourself, right? So if you're going to take an oath, you say, I swear to God, right? Or in Arabic, say, Wallahi. Okay, but you're taking an oath by something that is greater than yourself. But this is the word of Allah. This is Allah speaking. So since there's nothing greater than Allah, why exactly are there oaths in the Quran in general? And then why does he start off with wal asr? Okay, we'll come back to this idea of oaths in a little bit. But the first thing to understand is that there's an oath here. Allah is swearing by asr, which is time. But the term asr, it also signifies a type of constriction. And what I mean by that is that the interesting feature of Surah Al-Asr is that in its recitation, how you recite it related to your lips, related to its proper recitation, is that you have to kind of squeeze your lips and kind of squeeze out the particular words. So it starts off, wal asr. So you're kind of coming down, you're squeezing. Innal insana lafi khusr. إلا الذين آمنوا وعملوا الصالحات وتواصوا بالحق وتواصوا بالصبر. And so there's this squeezing, and some of the scholars mention that the reason it's called Surah Al-Asr is because of this squeezing. Because in Arabic, the word for juice is asir, which the reason they call it asir is because that which is squeezed. So if you have, that the orange juice, right? Asir burtuqal, right? This is the orange juice. Because you squeeze the orange, you get the juice out. So there's this idea of squeezing. So it's squeezing in two senses. Number one, because of how it's recited, wal asr, you hear it in its tone and its melody. But number two, there's this idea of squeezing out the summary or the essential elements of success. and hence it's wal asr. Allah's taking this oath by this particular time, or this particular word for time, which is al asr. Okay. Innal insana lafi khusr. Indeed, mankind is in a state of loss. Now, there's a couple of other points we'd like to make here. First and foremost is that you will be hard pressed to find in the Quran more emphasis than in this particular sentence. Meaning, there are so many elements of emphasis in this next ayah that you'll be hard pressed in the Quran to find this many elements of emphasis. Okay, now what do I mean by elements of emphasis? It's what's known in Arabic as ta'keed, right? What it means is the first word, inna, right? So if you're looking at the screen there, inna, the very first word, inna is an element of emphasis, meaning indeed, definitely, without a doubt. Sometimes they translate that as verily. So now there's this idea that's being cast forth that certainly, definitely, without a doubt, no matter what, just there's this absolute certainty. Inna al-insan, mankind. Now the term here, al-insan, the reason they translate it as mankind is because it is speaking about, because there's an alif lam, which gives it a definite article. So in English, sometimes a definite article would be the, right? The, right? In Arabic, it would be an alif lam. So it's al-insan. It leads this idea of it, the definiteness, or its ma'rifah, meaning all people. So it's not just insan, it's al-insan. So it's the entire gamut. It's every single human from the beginning till the end. So there's this idea of a second level of emphasis just from the fact that there is a definite article, al-insan. So inna al-insan. Indeed, definitely, no doubt, all of humanity, all of it, the entire gamut of humanity, lafi. Now, the lam here, la, and then there's fi, la is another element of emphasis. So the first one was inna, indeed, without a doubt, all of mankind. Lafi is indeed, without a doubt. So there's a second element of emphasis. Okay? Then it says fi. Now, fi means in Arabic. And then it ends off with khusr or khusrin, okay, is in a state of loss. Now, the fact that there's a fi here is very interesting. Why? Because it's as if you were thinking about this as mental imagery, right, in your mind, it's as if the human being or human beings in general are right in the center of this ocean of loss, of this ocean of, khusran, right? It's basically this ocean of loss. So as if they're drowning. That's kind of what the element you're kind of getting by the fact that there's a fi there, that they're in loss, like they're completely surrounded by khusran, but completely surrounded by loss. And the idea here is that you've got this element of emphasis twice, inna and the lam, al-insan, the definite that all of humanity or the entire gamut of humanity from the beginning to the end is indeed, definitely, no doubt, in the middle of this ocean of loss. Now, this paints a very bleak picture because, first of all, there's an oath, not an oath by myself or you. It's an oath by Allah. And the oath is that the entire gamut of humanity is in a state of loss. So this initially should bring a person almost to the state of depression. Like if all of mankind is at a loss, well, now what? Right? Well, what's the next? What do we do now? But then, as if there's like this ray of hope that comes out, illa, except. Okay, and then Allah mentions 4 elements that every single human being's in loss, except for people that have 4 elements. الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا, except for those who believe, وَعَمِلُوا الصَّالِحَاتِ, and do good deeds, وَتَوَاصَوْا بِالْحَقِّ, and encourage one another towards truth, وَتَوَاصَوْا بِالصَّبْرِ, and those that encourage one another towards patience. So everyone is drowning in loss except for these 4 particular type of people, or the people that have these 4 qualities. Okay, now that's just a quick translation. Now, this surah Imam Shafi'i, now he's one of the founders of the Shafi'i school, he made this very profound statement related about Surah Al-Asr. And he says about Surah Al-Asr, he says, لو لم ينزل من القرآن سواها لكفت الناس. That if this was the only surah to be revealed for the people, it would have sufficed. It would have been enough. And it just kind of goes back to this idea that what we were talking about earlier, that this surah, and this is Imam Shafi'i. Now, sometimes when we think about scholars, we may kind of bring up kind of people who we, in our contemporary age, are very intelligent and they have a large amount of knowledge and so on and so forth. So we may think about someone like Noam Chomsky, let's say, right? Very intelligent, very eloquent, so on and so forth, or whatever we think of when we think of a scholar. But what we have to understand is that scholars of the past, people like Imam Shafi'i, it wasn't just knowledge, but there was also the added element of piety. So a scholar, to be qualified as a scholar, was not only someone that was knowledgeable or someone that had collected facts, but that they coupled those facts with piety as well, with worship as well. And the fact that Imam Shafi'i, number one, the fact that his school was accepted so widely and spread, it's like an indication from Allah about his scholarship being accepted. And he makes a statement that if this was the only surah to be read, he didn't say Surah Al-Fatiha, he didn't say Surah Al-Ikhlas, he said this surah, Surah Al-Asr. If this is the only surah that was revealed, was sent down by Allah, it would be enough for people. It would be enough. Okay? And it goes back to this idea of the four elements of success. Now, in these four elements, before we dig down deeply into them, what we have to understand is when you go through the Quran, you find these four elements throughout the entire Quran. So, for instance, like I believe it was Shah Waliullah Dehlwi, and he has a book on the usul al-tafsir, the rules related to tafsir, and it's called Al-Fawz al-Kabir. And he mentions that the Quran, its division via Surah Al-Asr you can say it's divided topically, right? You've got one section of the Quran which talks about stories and history and facts and the future, right? In other words, Asr, the time period. So it talks about the history, Adam alayhi salam and Nuh alayhi salam, Musa alayhi salam. So there's history. Okay, it talks about certain stories, the story of Yusuf alayhi salam, and it talks about elements within the future, right? Yom al-Qiyamah and so on and so forth. So it's taking the entire gamut of time, the entire spectrum of time, and you find that in the Quran, and hence it starts off wal asr. Number two, he says that the idea of iman. Now this is throughout the entire Quran you'll find it, right? More so in the latter surahs, less so in the beginning surahs, but you'll find it there. So iman, the correct beliefs, the argument against the incorrect beliefs, and so on and so forth, that's found in the Quran. Righteous actions, obviously, the halal, the haram, those are also found in the Quran. This element, watawasaw bil haqq, it's basically encouraging people towards the truth. And this goes to the element of da'wah, calling people to the truth, encouraging them, to be just, to be righteous, and so on and so forth. Again, you'll find this throughout the Quran. And finally, the element of sabr, patience, is mentioned more than 90 times in the Quran. Various elements related to sabr. Okay, so that's just an overview of the ayah. We haven't even started to really dig deep yet. Okay? But understand that by time, indeed, mankind is in this total state of loss, entirety in the middle of it, and there's four elements that can basically save the person, save us as individuals. A couple of other points we want to highlight here. Number one is that as I mentioned, there's 3 ayat. But if you were to look at this in terms of a sentence, the first one would not be a standalone sentence. Okay? So you don't make an oath and stop. You don't say, I swear upon my mother's grave. Okay, but you're not going to just stop there, right? What is the object? What are you swearing about, right? What is the muqsam alay, as they're saying in Arabic, right? Well, what are you swearing about? You don't just say, wallahi. Okay, well, what is it? So the first statement, wal asr, is not a standalone sentence. Even though it's a standalone ayah, it's not a standalone sentence. You look at the second one. Innal insana lafi khusr. Now this, you can say, is a standalone sentence. But and then the last, illa alladhina amanu, except for those who believe and do good deeds and encourage towards truth and course of patience, that also is not a standalone sentence, right? So you would say, except for those who have believed, and you'll say, okay, well, wait a minute, what do you mean? Except for what? What's the exception? What's the istithna? What are we accepting from? So when we look at the surah's entirety, the central sentence, innal insana lafi khusr, is the one that ties both of these together. Because you could take the first oath and you could tie it to the second sentence, right? Wal asr innal insana lafi khusr. By time, indeed, mankind is a loss. And you could stop there. That would be a complete sentence. Or you could say, innal insana lafi khusr illa alladhina amanu وَعَمِلُوا الصَّالِحَاتِ وَتَوَاصَوْا بِالْحَقِّ وَتَوَاصَوْا بِالصَّبْرِ, right? That indeed mankind is a loss, except for those who, then that 2 and 3 would also then combine to form a complete sentence. So the central axis of the entire surah revolves around the idea of mankind being in a state of loss, being basically drowning in loss. And philosophically, when you think about the philosophical implications, what are we exactly talking about? You find that even in the realm of philosophy, this idea of the human tragedy comes up, in the sense that every single human being is in some sort of state of deficiency or loss, or in some sort of trouble, basically, right? So you could look at that a person is constantly struggling to get somewhere, right? So if you have, let's say, someone who's not very well off, they're kind of working and laboring day in and day out, right? They're laboring, they're working, and it's just a pure just struggle. And so all of these ideas related to like the problem of life, for instance, right? That you have to pay your bills and so on and so forth, and you're working tirelessly, day in and day out. Your life is in a state of loss, basically. You're in this, this kind of tragic state, in a sense. Okay. Now, that's someone who, let's say, is in a state of loss when it comes to them physically. And so because they're toiling away, because they're laboring away, this is a sense of a state of loss. In fact, Allah Azza wa Jal mentions in Surah Al-Balad, and He gives an oath about that, right? That in Surah Al-Balad, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions that the human being, we created man in hardship. لا أقسم بهذا البلد ووالد وما ولد لقد خلقنا الإنسان في كبد. And so indeed we have created the man toiling. And if you think about yourself as well, you're, in a sense, if you work, you're working kind of from the morning till the evening. You come home, it's just work, and you're kind of going forth, and you're just constantly one issue after another issue. Okay? Now, that's someone who's, let's say, not very well off. But then even someone who is well off, they may not be going through what's known as like a physical hardship, or a hardship when it comes to toiling away or working, but they may then have certain mental hardships. And so as I was mentioning earlier, this distinguishing between us and the animal kingdom. With the animal kingdom, let's say if they have children, they may take care of the children for a little while, but after the child is grown up, it's gone, right? It's out in the wild, it's, whatever, and then the mother might never even worry about it, right? But the human being is like that, right? When a human being has a child, it's constantly worrying about it. When it's young, it's worrying about its welfare, it's taking care of it. When it gets slightly older, when it's out in the real world, it's worried. When it doesn't call home from college, you worry. When it's out in the workforce, it's trying to get married, you worry. This idea of worry, the fact that the human being has an emotional component, is one of the mental challenges for the human being, meaning that even though someone may have a certain amount of wealth, they still are not cut off from loss or struggle, or this sort of having like a hardship related to your mind, what you stress about. As I mentioned, because of emotions, human beings, unlike the animal kingdom, they tend to worry a lot. And this worry basically defines the state of loss, right? In fact, one of the interesting things is they say that the poor man is one that'll work all day, right? And he or she's in a state of loss because they're working all day. But when it comes to sleeping at night, they will sleep like babies because they're so exhausted. But the wealthy person, they may not work as hard, but they'll be up all night just because of worries. Okay. Now, that sort of state of loss, that human tragedy, you find that in various elements of, philosophy, they talk about this. So, Buddha, for instance, his entire idea was that all of life is pain and all is suffering and all is agony. That was his entire kind of scope. That's basically how he defined life. That it's all about agony, it's all about suffering. Okay? Because of the various elements. Again, it's not about wealth, it's about there's some sort of struggle, some sort of suffering that you're going through. Now, what this surah is kind of saying is that all of humanity is in this type of state of loss. Except, and then it gives you the exception. How do you get out of the state of loss? And that exception has to do with 4 elements that are tied with the soul, a spiritual element. And you find this theme throughout the Quran. So, for example, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions, Ala awliya Allah la khawfun alayhim wa la hum yahzanun. Indeed, the awliya of Allah. Now, awliya is the plural of the word wali. And the word wali, sometimes they translate that as friend. But really what wali is, it comes from this idea of wilaya, which means when you're very, very close to something. You're very close to someone. So it may be friendship, but it may even be beyond friendship. You could have this wilaya with one spouse, for instance. You could have wilaya with, your neighbor. I mean, you have this extreme sense of closeness with a person or with a being or whatever it might be. And the opposite of that is adawa, which you get the word adu, which means an enemy. So the one thing is you don't want to have your enemies too close to you. You don't want someone that is against you to know too much about you, right? So if let's say Trump gets elected tomorrow and like right-wing Christians come out and they basically, the last thing you want is some crazy right-wing Christian guy knowing exactly where you live, where your kids go to school, and where you're going in the morning, where you come back. You don't want that. So you want to have a little bit of distance there, maybe a lot of distance there. You want adawa, right? That's why they call it udu. And so wilaya means closeness. And so here in this ayah, Allah says, ala awliya Allah, those that are the closest to Allah, they have this intimate spiritual relationship with Allah. La khawfun alayhim wa la hum yahzanun. They don't have any khawf, they don't have any fear, and they don't have any huzn, they have no sadness. Now, if you think about this idea of husr, of loss, and we're talking about this, this idea of like a mental type of hardship, there's 2 elements that a person could be in when it comes to worry. Okay, they could be in a state of sadness, and typically this has to do with items that happened in the past. Typically, not all the time, but a person will be sad over what has transpired in the past. A person could say, you know what, had I just done such and such, I would have reached such and such, right? Had I just listened to my parents, I would have gone to medical school, and today I would be a doctor and I'd be banking, right? Had I just listened to so-and-so, or had I just done such and so, you start to think about that and you start having this type of depression, sadness, and you start thinking like, man, if I'd only done such and such. So that's generally related to the past. Then you have certain elements related to the future, and you fear elements of the future. If Trump gets elected tomorrow, what if he rounds up all the Muslims? Is he going to put a hold on everyone's bank accounts in terms of Muslim bank accounts? All of my money that I've earned, will I not have access to it? And all of this. And so you start to fear, like, oh man, so what exactly will happen in the future? So in the future, the idea of fear is tied to the future, whereas the idea of sadness is generally tied to the past. Yet, the person who is close to Allah, La khawfun alayhim wa la hum yahzanun. They don't have any fear and they don't have any sadness. Because the one that is close to Allah has understood that whatever transpired in the past was because of the will of Allah. And whatever's going to happen in the future is because of the will of Allah. And nothing happens outside of the will of Allah. Now, this is a spiritual reality which is difficult. I mean, it's easy to say and easy to say that you believe it, but to internalize it, it's difficult, right? Because of all of the elements that we go through, right? And this idea that we've been given free choice, and therefore you can choose to do things. And because you've been given free choice, now when something happens, you start to regret and so on and so forth. So the idea of the presence of Allah in one's life, it gets more and more difficult. However, in order to fortify that, now coming back to Surah Al-Asr, in other words, to fortify the sense, that closeness to Allah, there are 4 elements. And those 4 elements, those who believe, do good deeds, enjoin towards truth, and enjoin towards patience. So that wilaya with Allah, in order to avoid fear and avoid sadness because of that spiritual closeness with Allah, has to do with these 4 elements. And that's how it's basically tied. So all of this is now tied to this idea of loss. Human beings are in this extreme state of loss. Okay, so now that's an overview of the surah itself. Let me go back real quick to a few more notes related to the word asr. Now remember, I said it has to do with like squeezing of the juice, but when it comes to the idea of time, there are a few words that are used, right? So in the Quran, Allah uses asr as time, but then also in Surah Al-Insan, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala uses the word dahr, right? And so as Allah says here, He says, has not هل أتى على الإنسان حين من الدهر لم يكن شيئا مذكورا. Has there not come upon man a period of time, الدهر, when he was not a thing even mentioned? So now dahr is a word used for time, and asr is a word used for time. But here's the thing, Allah uses 2 separate words. Why? When it comes to the word asr, it's referring to what they call serial time. And dahr is referring to absolute time. Now, what's the difference? What exactly do we mean? Serial time is when it's time that you can measure. So, for instance, you have your iPhone, it's whatever 9:30, and so you can measure that. And the way that happens is that if you trace it back all the way, you measure it because of daylight. You measure it because of how the days pass. And then if you take that further back, it has to do with the rotation of the earth related to the sun and the orbits and so on and so forth. And therefore, you now have time which you can measure. And that's asr. But dahr, as we saw, as is mentioned in Surah Al-Insan, that's absolute time without this idea of measuring. Meaning what? Meaning there's still an element of time, the space-time element, but it has nothing to do with the time that you can measure. And it's kind of shown from the surah, from the ayah itself. هل أتى على الإنسان حين من الدهر لم يكن شيئا مذكورا. Has there not come upon man a period of time when he was not even the thing mentioned? Well, what period of time was he not mentioned? He was not mentioned before anything was created. There was no earth, no sun, nothing. But was there time? Well, there was dahr, which is absolute time, because time, it was still there, and that's why Allah mentions dahr. It's this absolute time, right? And that time that Allah refers to can be, depending on how you measure it, can be different. Sometimes, as Allah mentions in the Quran, sometimes that time is related to 1,000 years of your counting. The Day of Judgment is 50,000 years, and so on. So the idea of time, it can be within our space-time complex that human beings exist in which case we call asr. But if it falls outside of that, it's called dahr. And actually, this ayah, هل أتى على الإنسان حين من الدهر لم يكن شيئا مذكورا, it's actually very powerful when you think about it. Because it's to remind the human being that, look, there was a point where nothing existed. And you were not even something that was mentioned. Right? There were no humans. Like you, this human being that has all of these emotional states, that gets angry when something happens, that gets sad, that, has hopes and dreams and ambitions, and that may be annoyed with all of this gamut of emotions, and that they have, this idea of some humans have arrogance, and some humans think of themselves as so great, and they have so much grandeur, and yet there was a time when you weren't even mentioned. None of this existed, and you were nowhere. And so it's to remind, it's kind of to put the human being in its place, right? Anyway, the point is that there's a distinguishing, there's the elements. One is asr and one is dahr. Now coming back to asr. Now why did Allah use wal asr? Well, we mentioned that we're going to have a little bit of a discussion related to oaths. Now, remember, we said that how is it that Allah takes an oath by something? Because typically when you take an oath, you take it upon something that's greater than yourself. Okay? So, like I said, you say, Wallahi, right? Or I swear to God, or I swear upon my mother's grave, or I swear to whatever, something that's just greater than yourself. But there's nothing greater than Allah. So how exactly do we understand this idea of an oath, wal asr? Well, the point here is that it's not necessarily due to the greatness of the object. Meaning, it's not because asr is, na'udhu billah, greater than Allah or something like this. But it has to do, when you think about the idea of taking an oath, of bearing witness about something. So if you're in a trial, the idea is you want to say something that is true. That's one thing. You want to kind of prove that what you're saying is true. Or you want to keep a promise. Okay, so when you have two parties, and you have, that someone wants to say something that's true, you want to kind of prove that you're speaking the truth. And so you take an oath. And therefore, the idea is that what you're taking, there's an idea of importance about the thing that you're taking oath by. Okay? In this case, the fact that Allah says, wal asr, asr referring to that serial time, meaning, that which you can measure, it's as if the oath is being taken by what's known as Ainul Asr, or the eye of time, right? In other words, if you were to think history, if you were to imagine time as, let's say, time incarnated into a human being, right? Obviously, we know that doesn't really happen, but incarnated as a human being. And it served as a witness. Now, because it's time, it has seen everything. So starting from Adam alayhi salam to Cain and Abel, to Nuh alayhi salam, and then all of the other prophets, and the earthquakes, and this and that, all of the elements of history, right? From the tyrants of the world, from Fir'aun and Hanan, and so on, all of these elements of history, Isa alayhi salam. And so it's seen all of that. It saw the entire seed of the Prophet ﷺ. It's seen everything now, but it's not only limited to history. It's also, because it's time, it's now seeing the entire future. And so because it has this type of viewpoint, it has this type of this grandeur, right? It's seen all of the elements. So the oath is now being taken by this element of time. In other words, as if saying, look, from beginning to end, the oath is being taken by this witness who is time and who is bearing witness over everything that's happened. Indeed, human beings are in a state of loss. Now, I hope you can see the connection there. In other words, time is the witness, and it, from its viewpoint, from its eye, from its metaphorical eye, it's seen all of this, and because it's seen all of it, it can now testify that indeed human beings or mankind is in a state of loss. And hence, that is why Allah, in this particular case, swears by Asr. And notice, he doesn't swear by Dahr, he swears by Asr. The idea of other oaths, by the way, just in case you're curious, because, for instance, there's other ayat that are, that where Allah gives an oath, وَالشَّمْسِ وَضُحَاهَا, by the sun, and so on and so forth.
those have other meanings related to the surahs that they're in. And some scholars have gone through and tried to kind of expound upon why that oath is taken in that particular surah. I think Ibn al-Qayyim al-Jawzi, again, has written a work on the oaths related to the Quran. But for our purposes, the relation between asr, time, and the fact that man is in a state of loss has to do with this idea of the witness that time has seen, you know? And so if you think about what all history has seen, the other element is that because it is serial time, it's measured time, you also get the sense that it's moving very quickly. Like dahr, because it's absolute time, it's outside the space time continuum, it's just there. It's just, okay, there you go, right? But asr, it's serial. It's moving from 1 second to the next, to the next, to the next. So not only is it a witness in the sense that it's seen everything, and therefore it can testify that human beings are in a state of loss, but also that there's this idea, or you get this sense that it's moving along very quickly. Meaning not only is the human being in a state of loss, but it's in a state of loss in its life, but also there's a state of loss related to what happens after it passes away. Because as for Muslims, as we know, it's not just loss in the dunya, but then there's loss when it comes to the akhirah as well. Meaning, if a person has, let's say, not lived his life according to Islam and so on and so forth, then there's loss, right? Starting from the grave, the punishment of the grave, and the day of judgment, and so on and so forth. So it's loss upon loss. And that loss, you get the sense, because it's wal asr, it's moving, it's coming very quickly, right? As the poet once said, related to this type of loss in this dunya, he says about this dunya, he says um, haramuha, he says halaluha hisab wa haramuha adab. He says it's halal, you have to give an account. Everything that was allowed, you have to give an account for. Every penny that you earned, every pound that you earned, every moment that you spent, where you spent it, how you spent it. It was all halal, but you have to give a point-by-point account. So he says, halaluha hisab, haramuha adab. And outside of that, everything else was haram, in which case there's punishment. And so he's got kind of this negative view of the world and dunya and so on and so forth. But the point is that you get the sense that it's coming very quickly. One of the examples that someone gave was like back a long time ago, before they had refrigerators, people were selling ice. And so when you think about selling ice, you have to sell it before it melts. And so just like that, this life that we have is passing very quickly. And like ice, you have to basically rid of it as quick as possible. Now that leads one other or another point related to the term asr, which I forgot to mention. That is that it refers to serial time, the idea of juice, squeezing, and so forth. But another meaning is related to what we know in salat, like the time of asr, right? So we pray at the time of asr. Now, why is this surah related to that? Well, basically, the time of asr is at the end of the day, when a person has worked and they have either gone to school or whatever it is, whatever you do, and you're concluding your day. And typically, you're going to be working towards some sort of a profit. So if you have a job, you're working, all the way up to like 5, 6 o'clock until asr time, and you're doing it to earn a certain, there should be some financial recompense for that. And so the time of asr is when that kind of comes to a conclusion. I mean, in this day and age, maybe not. Like if you work for an accounting firm, I feel really sorry for you because your hours are probably crazy. And I'm only saying that because I have a biased view of accounting. Anyway, so because I did accounting myself for a long time. Anyway, point being is like the asr, the time of asr is when all of that comes to, or generally should be when all of that comes to a conclusion. And you're basically wrapping up your transactions and you're going home, right? You've earned what you're going to earn. Like the ice seller, he either sells the ice or it's over. Similarly, this surah is basically pointing out as to what you have earned. At the end, it's Asr or Asr time. So what have you earned? Either you're going to be in a state of loss, you haven't gained anything, or you will have success in whatever you were toiling towards during the day. Okay, and this surah gives you that dichotomy. So it starts in innal insan lafi khusr. Either you're in the state of loss, indeed mankind is lost, or illa alladhina amanu wa amilu salihat wa tawasaw bil haqq wa tawasaw bis sabr. Except for those who have believed. So which state are you in when the day kind of comes to a conclusion? All right. So let me take a quick break here and see if there's anyone that has questions. So before I move on. So does anyone have questions before I move on? Okay. I don't see anyone, so. Okay. Okay, let's go to move on then. So we spoke about the term asr, and we spoke about the breakdown of innal insan lafi khusr. Indeed, mankind is in a state of loss. Now let's start to look at the exception. So if we're in the state that it's just total loss and everything is looking, everything is just looking down, it's looking bad. It's like there's, the question then comes out, where's the success? Like, how do you get out of this loss? And as I mentioned, it's like this ray of hope that comes up, right? Illa, except those who believe, those who do good deeds, and so on and so forth. Now, the idea is that if you have these four elements, you have success. And if you don't, you have absolute failure. Okay? And it's almost it's working in this term of the exception, right? Because remember, everything or everyone is in a state of loss. So there's this totality, and then you have the exception. Okay? So the point is that really it's not only giving you this idea of success, but it's also telling you failure, because it starts off with failure and then gives you the exception. All right. So what is the exception? The exception is that success is dependent upon these four elements. Okay? And you need all four of them in order to be successful. Okay? Now, in terms of the four that are mentioned, sometimes what happens is people tend to focus on one over the other. So someone may say, look, it's a lot of it's just related to belief, right? So they'll focus on the idea of belief, and they'll be a little shoddy on the action part, right? So they say, well, we believe in our heart, or whatever the deal is, right? And so when it comes to doing righteous deeds, they may fall short. Or someone may be doing a lot of righteous deeds. They're maybe doing a lot of praying and fasting and so on and so forth, but they're falling short upon encouraging other people to do that. Or let's say people are encouraging people to do that, but they give up very quick when the first sign of trouble. And so they're lacking in the realm of sabr, or the realm of patience. But the point is, you need all four in order to succeed, in order to get this idea of success. All right. Now, this first term, alladina amanu, those who believe. Now, obviously, we're talking about the item of iman, or the idea of iman. And what needs to be noted here is that the term iman, you can say there's two types of iman. There's a legalistic iman and then an actual iman. Now, what do I mean? A legalistic iman is basically, you could say it is Islam. In other words, you could replace that word legalistic iman with the word Islam. Meaning, when a person takes the shahada, they have a minimum level of iman and they become Muslim. And so that is what what you could say is like the legalistic iman. The person has now entered into Islam. But the true iman or the deep iman is different. And what's referred to here is the true iman, not just the legal implication or the legal idea of just becoming Muslim, right? And this is, you see this a lot in the Quran where that distinction is being made between iman and Islam, let's say, right? So, for instance, in Surah Al-Hujurat, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala talks or mentions about the Bedouin tribes that have come to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Now, Islam is now starting to spread, so the Bedouin tribes have come to the Prophet ﷺ, and قالت الأعراب آمنا. And so the Arabs, they're saying to the Prophet ﷺ, we are believers, we believed. And Allah tells the Prophet ﷺ, قُلْ لَمْ تُؤْمِنُوا. Say, no, you have not believed. وَقُولُوا أَسْلَمْنَا. But rather say that you have submitted. Say you're in the state of Islam. Or you could say like legalistic iman or legal iman, right? But the ones who have truly now believed, and then Allah goes on to give qualities of those believers, right? That إِنَّمَا الْمُؤْمِنُونَ الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا بِاللَّهِ وَرَسُولِهِ. Those are the true believers are the ones that have believed in Allah. And here we're talking about iman that is haqiqi, or iman that is true iman in Allah and His Messenger. And وَلَمْ يَرْتَابُوا, and they have no doubt. So when a person reaches true iman, doubts are then clarified. Okay? So true iman is one where there are no doubts. And that also ties in with the word itself, right? So here you'll notice, okay, let me see if I can actually do this. If I can, all right. Can you guys see that on the screen, the kind of the blank sheet there? Yeah? No? Okay, that's not good. So I'm assuming you guys are seeing seeing something else, huh? Hold on here. Let's see. Okay, can you see it now? The main screen? The blank screen? Yes, okay. All right, good. So we were saying now that when it comes to الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا, well, iman, let's try this here. Iman, and it's not letting me write. Hold on a second. All right, so, all right. Aha. Iman. Oops. All right. Okay, that's a very bad drawing of the word iman. But the point is that's iman, and it's tied in with the term amana. Okay, which means security or a state of safety. Now, if you think about iman, having a true iman is one which leads to a state of internal security. Now, what do we mean by that? Because the realm of iman has to do with a lot of philosophical questions. And philosophical questions are generally the end result of extreme philosophy is doubt. And so that settling of iman doesn't really happen, meaning you don't, if you're in the realm of philosophy, then iman doesn't lead to amana, doesn't lead to aman, as they say, right? Aman meaning security or peace or safety. It leads to something else. And so this idea of certainty comes from a secure iman. But you get that secure iman from various sources, right? And those sources aren't necessarily related to philosophy. And we'll get into this a little bit later as we go on because we need to kind of expound upon that. For now, what we want to understand is that there's two types of iman. A legalistic iman, which we can also say is Islam, or the external, and a true haqiqi iman, the iman in reality, right? And we said that is the iman that is a legalistic iman is also called Islam, which is to do with the outside actions. So, for example, the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam said that the Muslim is the one from whom people are safe, from whose tongue and hand people are safe. And the mu'min is the one whom people feel secure in their lives and their property. Now, there's a subtle message you can say here in this hadith of the Prophet ﷺ. Notice that when he said Muslim, referring to the idea of Islam, he said the person is safe from their is safe, meaning they're externally safe. The person is not going to be hit, or the person is not going to be cursed at. Okay, now this is an external action, hitting and cursing or whatever it is. They're safe from their hand and their tongue. So that's the Muslim, i.e., the one that is in the realm of Islam, legalistic iman. And the mu'min, now here we're going to iman haqiqi, the true iman, right? The mu'min is the one from whom people feel safe in their lives and their property. So the feeling, that internal feeling, the Prophet ﷺ refers to that as the mu'min, because that the mu'min is related to the inside, that inside internal state of security, whereas the legalistic iman or the Islam is related to the external actions. And there's many examples of this. Of course, the very famous hadith of Jibreel alayhi salam, right? When he came to the Prophet sallallahu and he asked him, "Akhbarni an al-Islam," tell me about Islam. The Prophet sallallahu mentioned the 5 pillars, which in essence are all external, right? So that you testify, again with the tongue, there's nothing worthy of worship except Allah, the prayer, zakat, fasting, hajj, all external actions. And then he says, "Akhbarni an al-Iman," tell me about Iman. He says to believe, again, it's all internal, in Allah and His angels and His prophets and so on and so forth, right? So internal and external. The Iman that's being referred to in Surah Al-Asr is the Iman. I'm actually, I realize that you guys didn't see this screen for the entire time, so I apologize about that. But we're here, it's Alladina Amanu. The Iman that's being referred to is that true Iman. Okay? So Iman has to do with the state of security and peace within oneself. And that has to do with clarifying any sort of doubts that arise, including philosophical doubts. So people go through all sorts of doubts, and in the context that we live in, you'll find that doubts are widespread. So people would have doubts in terms of, for instance, the problem of evil. Why would Allah cause let's say, good things to happen, or bad things, evil things to happen to good people? Why would Allah let evil exist? Why would Allah let evil happen? And so on and so forth, right? And so the one that has iman would be able to tackle this from the viewpoint of his or her iman. Okay, so, and of course, a lot of that and that the answers to those questions comes from the source of that iman, which is the Quran. And we'll talk about that more later as well. But for example, this idea of the problem of evil, as they say, right? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions, قُتِبَ عَلَيْكُمُ الْقِتَالِ, that indeed fighting has been prescribed upon you. وَكُرٌّ لَكُمْ, and you hate it. وَعَصَىٰ أَن تَكْرَهُ هُوَ شَيْءٌ وَهُوَ هُوَ خَيْرٌ لَكُمْ. There may be something that you hate, but there is good in it. وَعَصَىٰ أَن تُحِبُّهُ هُوَ شَيْئًا, and there may be something that you love, وَهُوَ شَرٌّ لَكُمْ, and it is evil for you. وَاللَّهُ يَعْلَمُ وَأَنْتُمْ لَا تَعْلَمُونَ. Indeed, Allah knows and you don't. And so the main problem when it comes to this idea of evil is a problem of knowledge, as Allah concludes the ayah with. In other words, the human being has been given a limited sense of knowledge. And by that limited sense of knowledge, it makes these grandeur conclusions. Well, that was totally evil. But even evil itself, it's relative. it's so a lion chasing down a gazelle. It's evil for the gazelle, but it's good for the lion. So good and evil are actually relative and from the viewpoint of the human being. But yet we make absolutes when it comes to good and evil. And here Allah is saying that you're using your minuscule knowledge, right? As Allah says in another place in the Quran, وَمَا أُوتِيتُم مِّنَ الْعِلْمِ إِلَّا قَلِيلًا. You've only been given a small amount of knowledge. And so you're using this minuscule amount of knowledge and you're making a grand conclusion, right? وَاللَّهُ يَعْلَمُ وَأَنْتُمْ لَا تَعْلَمُونَ. And Allah knows and you don't. That perhaps there is something in that is good, but you don't know it. And perhaps in something that you love, there may be some evil in it, and you just don't know it because by necessity, as a human being, you're limited in knowledge. Now, my point in illustrating that is that when a person has Iman and they engage with the Quran and so on and so forth, that Iman causes an internal state of security or peace. And this internal state of security you generally don't get when it comes to philosophy, right? They say, one of the things they say about philosophy is that philosophy is the name of of um, of giving bad reasons for things that you believe on instinct, right? Because that's what the end result of philosophy is. And like I said, we'll get into that a little more, later on, bi'idhnillah. So the first point is this idea of iman and true iman, not just the external ashhadu an la ilaha illallah, ashhadu anna Muhammad Rasulullah. You make the statement and that's it. But we're talking about a deep, deep iman. Okay, and then that also has it's how you develop that iman. We're going to get into that a little later because each one of these four elements is going to be expounded upon. Remember, we started off with the example or the analogy of the seed and the seed that germinates. So each one of these elements, we'll get into it more and more, and to put ourselves on the balance. So when it says الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا, those who believe, well, are we amongst that quality, right? And so we'll look at this idea of belief versus nifaq, let's say hypocrisy, and how we're supposed to test ourselves and how do we improve ourselves related to the first quality, and we'll have other elements as that germinates. So the first quality is iman. The second quality is amilu salihat, is righteous actions. Now the thing to know about righteous actions, first, the words that Allah Azza wa Jalla uses. Now let me come back here. There we go. Now, let's see here. Can I get rid of that? There we go. All right. Good. All right. All right. You guys can still see that, right? Screen with all those annoying dots. Okay. Now, when it comes to actions, in Arabic, there's two, there's more than two, but let's say there's two words that are typically used. One of those words is, let's see if I can draw it here. It is fa'al. Okay? Fa'al or fa'al. And the other word is, as you can see, I don't have much practice with this, is amal. And here, the word that Allah uses in Surah Al-Asr is amilu or amal. It comes from the word amala, right? So what's the difference between fi'l and amal? Well, fi'l is an action that happens or is done in whatever way, with or without intention. Now, whether that action is easy or whether it's hard, but it happens whether there's an intention, whether there's no intention, it's an action. So it's a very general word. But the word amal, it means there is an action, but it by necessity, what's tied in with that particular action is an intention. And so enters in the very famous hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, إِنَّمَا الْأَعْمَالُ بِالنِّيَّاتِ. Actions are only, and the word there is amal, the actions are only by intention. And so when the word amal is used, or amala, it has to do with, number one, that there is an intention behind it, but also that the particular action is one where there is hard work or challenge, mushaqqa. So fi'l could be an easy action or a hard action, right? It's just fi'l, it's just an action. But amal, number one, there's an intention behind it. Number two, it's something that is going to be difficult, or it's going to take hard work, or it's going to be challenging. There's effort involved. So there's free choice and there's effort. And both of these are necessary components of the word amal, right? So when Allah says amilu salihat, it's not just talking about an action that happens or an action, but these are very specific actions that are tied with intention and are tied with difficulty. Now, there's levels of difficulty, so we don't want to say that they're totally, completely difficult. But the point is, there's levels of difficulty. So, amilu salihat, the other word here that's being used is salihat. Just get rid of this. Okay. And the word salihat, its root is, let me see a minute. Salaha. Salaha. Okay. Now, salaha, what we're talking about is actions that are, for now, we can say just are righteous and pure and clean in a sense, right? Actions that they result in a higher spiritual state or in an elevation of one's character. Okay, so it's not just actions that are intention or actions that are hard, but these are actions that, because they have to be amilu salihat, they have to be salah, they have to have a necessary component of being spiritual or elating a person spiritually, or having an elevation of one's character. So now it's not just general actions, very specific actions. Okay? Now, if we think about righteous actions, one of the things that we want to understand is that righteous actions, or amalu salihat, are what distinguish man from animals. Now, we've been having this whole motif about animals versus man, but we'll add to that motif angels as well. You see, this motif of angels and animals and the human being, it's used by a number of scholars of the past, especially. So Ibn al-Qayyim uses this when he's expounding upon the idea of patience. And he talks about sabr, and we'll get into that probably next time now. But he talks about the idea in terms of human beings, right, being in between angels and animals, and sabr being one of the qualities that distinguishes the human being from both of these categories. Okay, and another scholar of the past who uses this motif is Imam al-Ghazali. And he uses it in a very interesting way, because he says, look, when it comes to the human being has two types of impulses. One type of impulse he calls ba'ath al-hawa, right? It is the impulse of desire. And the second impulse, he calls it ba'ath ad-din, which is the religious impulse. And both of these impulses, they work against each other. And so what happens is, coming back to the motif of human beings, animals, and angels, he says that when a human being, when the ba'ath al-hawa, or the desires of a human being, right, the external impulses, or the desire impulses, when they overtake ba'ath ad-din, the religious impulses, the human being then falls to the level of the animals. Because an animal, it's overtaken, its primary function basically is ba'ath al-hawa. It's just, it's whatever its instinct says, whatever its desire says, or whatever its desire dictates, it does it. If it's hungry, it'll hunt down food. If it's thirsty, it'll go get water. If it's, if it needs to procreate, it'll procreate, right? So when the human being, when you compare the ba'ath ad-din with the ba'ath al-hawa, with the religious impulses versus the impulses from desire, if the impulses of desire are greater than the impulses of religion, or that internal religious impulses, The human being falls to the level of the animals. But at the same time, the human being is the unique being that if its ba'ath al-din overcomes its ba'ath al-hawa, if its ba'ath ad-din, if its religious impulses overcome its impulsive desire, then it reaches the level or surpasses the level of the angels. And that choice is rooted in amalu salihat. Because amalu salihat is related to actions that, number one, we said they're amal, so it has to have an intention. It's done through volition, a free choice. So there has to be intention. It has to be difficult, not something that just, you just want it so you get it. And so it has to have a level of difficulty. Doesn't mean it has to be extremely difficult, but it has to have a level of difficulty. And it has to be something that takes a person closer to Allah, either by way of their character or by way of their spirituality. And those actions are what determine whether the doing of those actions take the person to the level of the angels or above, and the leaving off of those actions take the person to the level of the animals or below the animal of the level of the animals. Okay, now I wanted to kind of quickly, because we still have a lot to go, but obviously there's elements we'll save for the next class. But just quickly to go over tawasi bil haq and tawasi bil sabr before we conclude, and we'll open up for Q&A. But so let me minimize this here. Actually, we'll just do this. Okay. So the first element, alladhina amanu, was iman. Amalu salihat, we spoke about that. Now tawasul bil haq. It is, now this term, tawasi or tawaso, it's in, for those of you who are studying, who may have studied some Arabic morphology, it's what's known as babul taf'al, or tafa'ul, excuse me. And what that means is that it is not only encouraging in one direction, but it's a mutual encouragement. Meaning, it's not just one person encouraging another, but there's a mutual, like, you're encouraging people and people are encouraging you. So it's a two-way encouragement, right? And so it's this idea of working together. That's the first element, or the first idea behind the fact that it's tawaso. The other thing is that tawaso also has an element which is known as mubalagha, meaning it is not just something light, but it has an element of, again, kind of working hard, or having, so I don't want to use the word extreme, that wouldn't be right, but meaning that there is mushaqqa in it, that there is this element of kind of working hard at encouraging each other. Okay, so that word tawaso, it's to encourage one another, but number one, it works in two directions, encouraging one another, and number two, there's an element of mushaqqa, right? There's mubaligha, right? There's this working hard. Now the term haqq, basically, we'll just say for now, because we're running out of time, it refers to truth. And truth is, again, we don't really have time to get into it now, and we'll talk about it more into detail. But understand that haqq has a few meanings that are corollary to truth, right? Because truth, in essence, the truth is one, you can say, in a sense, right? But at the same time, the word haqq also refers to a number of other things. It refers to rights, right? So that's why they say haqooq al-walidain, the rights of the parents. Okay, so it has to do with rights. It has to do with that which is true. It has to do with that which is present, right? Because if something is not present, it's absent, and therefore it's outside the realm of truth because you can't really sense it. All right. The truth, haqq, is also that everything that a sound intellect establishes. And finally, haqq has to do, is that which leads to a beneficial result. Okay. Now, like I said, we'll talk more about this next time and we'll dig down into it. But let me just finish off with tawasi bis sabr. Sabr, it is, generally it's translated as patience. But the thing we want to understand is that encouraging of patience is tied in with encouraging the truth. Because anytime you encourage the truth, now if you're calling people to be more just, to be more righteous, to be fair, and so on and so forth, you will have people that will accept that, And then you'll have people that won't accept it. And when they don't accept it, then there's an element of patience that needs to happen with that. Now, sabr has a number of different levels, but again, because of time, I wanted to leave some time for Q&A, and we've been going for some time now. So we'll continue that discussion next time, bi'idhnillah. So I'll go ahead and stop here for this session. Let me just conclude with this, that if you would like to continue with these sessions, please make sure you go ahead and register. We'll be sending out more notes and obviously the recordings and things like that. And of course, any sort of feedback you have, I'd appreciate that. You can email myself, and I'll type in the email here in the chat box. Let me see. So it's at dcseminary.com. So it's Fahad at dcseminary.com. So any sort of feedback, that would be great, inshallah. And if you know me personally, you can give me that feedback personally, because I recognize some of you here. So with that said, does anyone have any questions, whether it's related to the course, logistics, or anything else? And what I do with like my live classes is that if nobody has questions, I start asking you guys questions. And since I can see all your names, it's great. And since I know some of you, it's even better. I can put you guys on the spot. Okay. Now, I hope you guys aren't like typing the questions and I can't see them, right? Or first of all, if you guys can just type yes in the chat box, so I know that I'm actually going to receive the questions, if there are any, inshallah. Okay, so someone asked about, no questions for now. Okay, the curriculum itself. Okay, so we'll be covering Surah Al-Asr. We'll move on to what's known as Ayatul Bir. And Ayatul Bir has to do with, in Arabic, they call it Bir, and they translate it as righteousness. But as we see when we get there, it's more broad than righteousness, right? So it includes like the idea of the internal consciousness of a human being, right? Or that person says like, that's itching away at my conscience, right? So it has to do with conscience. It has to do with righteousness, and then the idea is that when you have something that's itching away at your conscience, how do you make that in line with what Allah wants? Okay, so that's what Ayatul Bir covers. And then Ayatul Bir, it actually it gives us more details about each one of these elements. Right? So for example, Alladina amanu, those who believe, in Ayatul Bir, we're given more elements related to what belief is, right? It's to believe in Allah and His books and the angels and the messengers. And so we'll talk about each one of those as we move forward. Then Amalu Salihat, it talks about charity and so on and so forth. So we start to see each one of these blossoming, right, in Ayatul Bir, and from the viewpoint of what Bir is. Then after that, we'll move on to Surah Luqman, and that gets into more of the philosophical ideas, because the very first thing that we see when we come to Surah Luqman is that whereas the ayah that we talked about, Surah Al-Bir, is around the concept of Bir, the ayat in Surah Al-Luqman that we're looking at is around the shakhsiyah, or the personality of Luqman. And so we need to understand who Luqman was. The fact that he wasn't a prophet has profound implications on the fact that he was given wisdom, and then what exactly is hikmah, or wisdom, related to philosophy, answering questions about life and death and so on and so forth, and those questions that kind of eat away at a person in the realm of iman. And then we'll see the advice that he gives his son in the realm of amalu salihat and enjoining towards good, where we see the concept of Amr bil Ma'ruf wa Nahy anil Munkar, right? Enjoining good and forbidding evil. And how exactly does that transpire living as minorities in the West, right? Because obviously we want this to be something that is practical and not just information based. So it's not just a gathering information, but it is something that we can now apply within our lives. And so that's kind of what we have laid out as we go forth. And that's level 1 out of 6 levels. All right. Let's see what else we have. So we have here. What is the context of this surah and which circumstance was this revealed to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam? Okay, so as we know, some surahs, they have what's known as asbab or sabab nuzul. They have a reason of revelation or a cause of revelation. Actually, all of the surahs do, but or we could say the majority of surahs do, but some of them we know and some of them we don't. So as far as I know, and I'll look this up again, that I don't think there's a specific context of the surah in which it was revealed to the Prophet ﷺ. Now, don't quote me on that. I'll have to check that up. But from the various books of tafsir that I went through, there wasn't a particular circumstance in which it was revealed. Now, there are certain hadith that talk about Surah Al-Asr. For example, one hadith mentions that when it came to, actually this is an athar that the Sahaba, that two Sahaba would not part ways until they recited Surah Al-Asr, and then they would say Assalamu alaikum, and then they would part ways. And so it just kind of, now it's not the cause of revelation, but it is a highlighting of the importance of the surah, in the sense that these are two of the Sahaba, the companions of the Prophet ﷺ, and their own their own kind of status and so on and so forth, and they would recite it before they would part ways. So it kind of just, again, gives credence to the idea of its importance. You said amal is action by necessity or an intention and is going to be difficult. How do we put that in everyday life, things we do, like our nafs, or how do we follow the Quran and Sunnah? Okay, so now amalu salihat, we said that it has to do with that there's intention behind it, and it has to have a level of difficulty. Now, any action that is going to be done has to have two qualities, that's going to be accepted by Allah, has to have two qualities. It has to have the intention, a correct intention behind it, and it has to be a correct deed according to what the Prophet ﷺ has taught us, or whether it's the Quran, from the Quran, or from the Sunnah. Okay, so for example, if I said, you know what, inshallah, tomorrow I will go and rob a bank purely for the sake of Allah. Okay. Now, I could be very sincere in my intention. Like, I'm going to rob the bank and I'm going to do it purely for Allah. I'm going to take all the money and give it to the masjid. Okay. Now, because this is missing the element of correctness, then this is an action that Allah won't accept. Okay. Now, take the opposite example. You have someone who's praying in the masjid, and they start the salah, and everything is going forth, and they're praying with a nice, perfect ruku'. They go into bowing perfectly, they go into sajda perfectly, nice long sajda. And someone comes and they say, "Wow, this guy, he's so, he or she is so great. They're praying so perfectly." So he finishes off. He says, "Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah, assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah, and by the way, I'm fasting too." Okay. Point being, this person wasn't exactly doing it for Allah. He's showing off his deeds, and in that case, this is where action is correct, but the intention is now skewed. But in order for an action to be correct, it has to be correct on those levels. And amalu salihat, the terminology here signifies both of them. You have to have both in order for the action to be accepted under the realm of amalu salihat. Did that kind of clarify what you're asking? Okay, good. All right. Any other questions? Great. All right. Alhamdulillah. Let's see. 1, 2, Okay, we were going to talk about that next time, but just briefly, the term sabr has to do, well, understand first that there's three types of sabr that the scholars have categorized it in, right? They say that there is sabr al-ma'siyah. It's, see, I don't want to translate as patience, but let's say patience against doing sins. In other words, you have to withhold, you have to be patient when it comes to avoiding doing sins. Okay. The second level is sabr an ta'atillah, which is the sabr when it comes, or the patience when it comes to obeying what Allah has ordered. And then finally, there is sabr in the realm of um, when you're going through some sort of hardship, right? And each one of these has levels, and that's what basically what we're going to be talking about and how it's related to our lives. So that's going to be very important because remember, we talked about the idea of being in a state of loss. That can be either physical or mental, and that hardship. And sabr has a lot to do with dealing with that state of loss. And that's why it's mentioned there in the first place, right? Because when a person is going through issues and hardships and so on and so forth, sabr is his or her best companion. But what exactly is sabr? What do we mean by sabr? What is the appropriate level of sabr? What is not? That's all elements we'll be getting into next time. And we'll be continuing to get into that throughout. Okay, any other questions? Okay, so let me ask you guys this. Um, how did you find the session tonight? Let me just be very blunt. And if you thought it was good, that's fine. But I'm more kind of like to know more about how it can be, let's say, improved. So any advice for me or for as we move forward in the session? And by the way, the Prophet ﷺ said, "Ad-dinu nasiha," right? That deen is giving good advice, right? The religion is giving good advice. So I'm asking you guys for that, inshallah. Someone said a 5 minute break. Okay. All right. I'll keep that in mind, inshallah. Anything else? Was the material too much, too little? Should we kind of do more in one sitting? What do you think? Oh, there was an echoing. Okay. Well, hopefully the recording won't have that, inshallah. Okay, more can be done. This was a short one, like you mentioned. Yes. Okay. So we can probably do more. Okay. That's good because the next items that are coming up are actually more intense. Didn't want to scare away too many people. So, inshallah. But not too much more. Okay. Okay, khair, inshallah. All right. Anyone else? Wayaki. Okay, sounds good. All right, so I guess we're pretty much done here for tonight. So, as I mentioned, if you'd like to continue, just go ahead and inshallah register. Um, and in terms of like the application, if you can fill it out, that would be good. That gives me an idea of kind of the people that are taking the course and so on and so forth. It's not a very long application, so you can, or you can directly register as well. You can kind of skip the application. It's up to you guys. And the other thing I wanted to mention is that if someone needs like financial aid, that's available too. We're not trying to exclude anyone from taking this course. So if you need financial aid, just email admin. Let me just type it here. Let's see, admin at dcseminary.com. Okay.
And that's pretty much it. So jazakumullah khair for taking out the time, coming in, and is there a question? Wayak. Taking out the time, coming in, and like I said, if you have any sort of advice for me, please let me know, whether it's related to the course or anything else, bidnillah. And hopefully I will see you guys tomorrow evening at the same time. جزاكم الله خير سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك أشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت أستغفرك وأتوب إليك والسلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته